All right, so hello. This will be my video on DNA. This is the second of 3 videos, and like I said in the last video, I do recommend that you watch them in the established order because these concepts do tend to build on each other. So in order to get the best learning experience out of it, you should watch them in the established order. The first video was on cells. This one, of course, is on DNA, and the final one will be on evolution. So, what is DNA? So, DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. So, uh, this this is when a molecule composed of 2 polynucleotide chains that coil around each other form a double helix. So, these were first identified by Swiss chemist Friedrich Miescher. This was back in the 1860s, but he wasn't the one who got most of the credit for this sort of thing. Later, they were photographed by Rosalind Franklin, who was a biographer. She also did not receive much credit for this. The two most famous figures ended up being James Watson and Francis Crick, who developed the double helix structure. So, DNA carries genetic instructions for the development, functioning, and growth, and as well as reproduction of all known organisms, as well as many viruses. In viruses, it is more likely to be known as RNA, which means it is only one strand present. So instead of the typical double helix structure that you see in DNA, you will see one strand, which is known as RNA. So these individual strands, when they are present in DNA, they are known as polynucleotides. They join to one another to form a double helix through what is called covalent bonds, and that is more of a chemistry concept. So, the structural buildup of DNA. So, the nucleotides containing phosphate groups make up the double helix. And in these phosphate groups, they're made up of a type of sugar known as glucose, and they're joined with a nitrogen base. Now, there are 4 types of nitrogen bases, and these nitrogen bases, you may recognize the letters here because these are what are known in most of genetics, in the sense that these are the different arrangement of these letters are what make up genetic code. Now, behind the letters, they are known as adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. So, as I said before, the order of the nitrogen bases determines the genetic code, which then in turn determines the traits that are exhibited by them. And these are distributed along chromosomes. And within the human body, there are 46. So where is the DNA in the cell? So as I mentioned in the last video, it is located in the nucleus. So on this diagram, you can see that here is your eukaryote cell. You can see the flagella and all of the membrane-bound organelles. But the one we're paying attention to here is this orange one right here. As you can see, it has a thick wall around it in order to protect the DNA. This is extremely important because DNA is something that can be damaged and to be catastrophic if it is. For example, if you were to get direct contact with sun rays into the DNA, it could cause a dangerous mutation causing skin cancer. So historically, the cells in the human body have evolved to create protective layers in order to protect the DNA because of how crucial it is that it stays safe. So if you look at this, of course, you can see the walls. And in this diagram, you can see that there's a little ball here. And that ball is actually made up of coiled up chromosomes. And you can see right here all the individual coils. And these make up each individual double helix. And you can see right here, these are the nitrogen bases. Now, if you'll notice in this diagram, there are 4 different colors. These represent the 4 nitrogen bases that I mentioned in the last slide. And in each cell, there are 3 billion of these base pairs. So, genotypes and phenotypes. Now, these are widely used terms, and you may know what they are, but I'll be going into more depth on them in this slide because it will be very important for the next video. So genotypes are these genes or sets of genes responsible for determining an organism's characteristics. So they're represented by a pair of alleles and they're written in uppercase or lowercase letters. And this depends on if the gene is recessive, in which case they're lowercase, or dominant, in which case they're uppercase. So for example, if you had a blue eye allele and a brown eye allele, it would be capital B, lowercase b. Now it is customary to put the dominant alleles first. Makes sense since it is the dominant one, and it is the one that will therefore be expressed. So it is put first before the recessive allele. So a lowercase b, capital B would not be proper formatting of it. And so to label these pairs of alleles that are representing the same trait are known as homozygous. You see the root word homo, which means the same, because it's the same two alleles. Pairs that are different are known as heterozygous. Hetero meaning different, which represents that there are two different traits that are being represented here. So phenotypes are the actual observable traits of an organism. These are written as the express trait, and a way to remember this is that pheno, ph, sounds like physical, which is the physical characteristics that are shown by an organism. So an example of this would be blue eyes, brown hair, blonde hair, brown eyes, curly hair, tall, short, anything really. So next slide. So dominant versus recessive genes. So each organism receives two versions of each gene from each parent, of which they can be known as dominant or recessive. A dominant gene is one who masks or overrides the effect of the other variant of the gene in the presence of it. The recessive, by default, becomes that gene whose effects are masked in the presence of a dominant gene. Now, there actually is some logic behind why genes are dominant versus recessive. So for this, I'll be going with the example of eye color. So as you may know, the blue eye color initially came about as a result of a mutation. This mutation involved the pigment for the eye not showing up. So in the case of, let's say, capital B, lowercase b, a heterozygous allele pair, you would have one that doesn't have pigment, one that does have pigment. If you have those together, there will still be pigment, which means that the eye will still be brown because there is still pigment there. So there is some logic behind the expression of which gene is chosen. And it, of course, gets a lot more complicated with different gene combinations, but that is just an example. So if you have two dominant genes, they are known as homozygous dominant. Two recessive genes are known as homozygous recessive. And of course, as I mentioned before, a dominant and a recessive gene are known as heterozygous. There's no such thing as homozygous heterozygous or dominant heterozygous or recessive heterozygous. It is just heterozygous. And these work with the work with these types of genetics is known as classical genetics, as it is based on Gregor Mendel's work. So there are two different variants. There are also variants of this because it's not completely exact. You don't just have two options. So there's the event that codominance is exhibited and the event that incomplete dominance is exhibited. So codominance is when both alleles are expressed in a phenotype. That essentially means, so let's take a flower petal, for example, or a flower, for example. If you were to have a red flower and a white flower to reproduce, in the upcoming offspring, you would have flowers that have red petals and white petals. So it would be like, it would be mismatched essentially. Incomplete dominance, however, is when a mixture of both alleles is expressed in the phenotype. So in that same example, instead of having flowers that have petals that are, some are red and some are white, you would instead have petals that are all pink because it would mix the red and the white to make a pink. So that's the way to remember this. Codominance is when they're both expressed. So the red and the white are expressed. Incomplete dominance is when they're mixed. So red and white mix to make pink. So this is the introduction for DNA. I thank you for watching. Next up, we will be talking about evolution. And again, definitely do not go around with these videos. It is very important that you watch them in the correct order, as like I said, they do build on each other as concepts. So again, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.